Hi guys, and welcome back to day 8 of Inktober, and today I wanted to do something that was more finished. So today is kind of like a very small but finished piece of artwork, and today I'm working on Bristol board, Strathmore Bristol board I believe, and I'm using Micron pens and Copic markers and a light box and a little bit of masking tape, and I'll have a link down in my description to all of the products that I'm using if you're curious. But yeah, so today I had actually sketched out the sketch in a sketchbook first, and I was really liking how it was going. And when I cut out the paper, the Bristol board for the final product, I decided that I actually wanted to have a bit of a white border around the edge. And I always do this when I'm working in watercolor, and I love that look. I love when there's just this like nice clean white border around really any artwork. So I wanted to include that in this one. And this is where it kind of turned into a little bit of an experiment, because I've never actually tried doing this technique, masking off the corners or the edges when I'm using Copic marker. So I wasn't sure if the Copic marker would seep underneath the tape or not. And I feel like I've done this maybe once before and it did actually bleed under it, but I was using different paper. So I think when I started with this Bristol board, I was hoping that it would kind of turn in the way I wanted it to. And if it didn't, it would be okay because I could just trim off the extra. But yeah, so I went in with this masking tape, which is really low tack if you've never used it before, so it won't damage the paper at all. It's really actually very great. I use this tape all the time. And at the very beginning of this piece, I'm not sure I even show it, but when I took the sketch and I put it on top of the light box and then I put the paper on it just to start getting it all compositionally positioned where I wanted to on the piece, I had actually only drawn that center figure. I had only had her, and then I was putting it on the paper, I was realizing that it was not as interesting as I could make it. I had this great opportunity where I could add more detail and more interest to it, and I really did want to push this one so that it was a lot more involved than just one simple portrait sitting there in the middle of this shape. So I went back and I took off the Bristol board and I just quickly sketched in these two other characters behind her, and I did want to make sure that they all three had these masks on, and I absolutely love drawing masks. I love it because I can really push the forms of the face in the way that I want, and the shapes and the overall mood that they're showing in a way that when I'm using an actual human face, I don't really want it to be that abstracted or disfigured. I want them to still look human, but when I'm doing a mask, I feel like it breaks me free of that, and I can really push all these different shapes and have a lot of fun with how I'm really displaying this face. So that's honestly one of my absolute favorite things to draw, are masks like this. So I was really excited when I was working on this because I could work on 3 masks in this little picture. And it was really important for me to be able to have all 3 of these characters really have a lot of similar lines and shapes. For one thing, since the shape or the dimensions of the piece itself is so small, there's not a lot of space for me to really put a lot of different things to balance it out. So I wanted to make sure that they just all kind of interlocked together and really had similar strokes to them and had these S-curve that mirrored each other. So I did focus really heavily on the hair for these characters. So I really wanted most of what you're seeing of the background characters to be their hair. And then also the front character, she had this long hair that framed it out, and on both sides I made sure that the hair came down to about the same position on both sides of the composition of the paper itself. That way it was really balanced out, and she was framing out first and then they were coming in second behind where her hair kind of bordered it off. But I think this detail that I'm putting in right here is actually one that I probably shouldn't have, where I was putting all these little like dots in part of her clothing. Because I did have other dots in the design, so around in her face I would use the dots to continue a line so that it kind of broke off and faded into these dots. And then I had them in the hair too. I really actually like using that technique where I'll start a stroke and then fade it out so that it turns into a couple little dots, and then it can turn into another brush stroke that's more solid. I really like the texture that that gives and the variety to the strokes that I can get when I'm adding these dots into it. So when I went into this clothing, I was thinking, well, I'll just mirror that. I'll put these dots in there too. But in the end, they ended up looking too far removed from what I was referencing in the other areas of this piece. And it looked too much like, it just kind of looked out of place from the rest of it because it was a pattern of dots rather than a directional line created with dots, it just looked out of place. There's nowhere else in this piece that had that kind of pattern to it. And once I put it down, I wasn't completely in love with it, and I did know that I was going to be coloring this piece in a little bit, so I was hoping that once I got to that point I would be able to add some color on top of this so that overall it would diminish the look of those dots and it wouldn't be quite as glaringly standing out as being the sore thumb in this piece, where it was the only element like that. And when I was working on these, I have been using 3 Micron pens. I got them in a set where they're the size 01, size 03, and size 05. And I don't remember exactly what the like actual size of the nib was. I think it's like 0.25 point. Anyways, I don't remember exactly what they were, but those are the sizes of the Microns on how they like to size them. But for this, I wanted to make sure that the front figure, that she had the darkest and the thickest lines, and then the figures farther back had slightly lighter, thinner lines. That way they would kind of fade more and they would have this distance to them. They'd look like they were receding, and it would give them a little bit more differentiation from the front figure so that they would really just break apart rather than being really homogeneous. And in the end, I don't think I pushed it nearly enough for it to actually have the effect that I wanted it to. I think I should have done the back figures much, much thinner. But I tried, and I learned that what I did do was not quite enough. But one of the main things that I focused on to try to get that effect was in the front figure, I was using the full range of the pen sizes, specifically focusing on the 05 for the really long strokes like her hair and her clothing, and then just the thinner ones I tried to focus more on the small details like her face. So I tried to focus on the thicker pen for her, and then for the 2 figures back I barely even touched the 5. I only used the 5 to like color in details that were going to be black, and I focused mostly on the 3 and the 1. So all in all, I think that it was the right direction to try to go in, but I think I should have been a little bit lighter handed when it came to actually thickening up the lines, because I think I went in and added a little bit more bulk to them so that in the end they did kind of become a little bit homogeneous with that front character. And there's definitely some points as I'm rewatching this where I'm like, oh, don't put that marker down, it did not work for it. But in the end, after adding different layers and different colors to build it up, it ended up being something that I'm okay with, that I feel pretty happy with and proud, particularly knowing that some of the weird choices that I made, particularly for the background, I think that I ended up doing like several different layers of it, and some of the layers looked really, really patchy. And I think that's just kind of by virtue of using Copic markers on Bristol board in really large areas. You have to be really, really careful about making sure that you're going slow enough that the ink is sinking into the Bristol board so it can get a little bit more of an opaque kind of flat color. And that's just really hard to do when it's this big open space like that. So when it is big spaces like that, I do end up actually doing lots of layers so that I can really build up the color and get rid of that really patchy look. So going over with multiple layers wasn't really the issue, but I did try a few different colors that were definitely not right for this piece. But overall, I was able to get it to a point where it was a little bit more of a neutral color, and then I let the only color in that piece be the characters themselves, so then they were able to pop off from the background. And I actually took a step away from this piece and then came back to it, and there were a few little tweaks that I made, and once I made those, I liked this piece a lot more. The first one was that I took a little bit of a darker blue and I added more shadow back into those back characters, and I also went in and the bodice of that front character, I darkened it with a C6, I believe, or C10. It was a really dark, cool gray, and the reason that that needed to be there is because I had colored over parts of her clothing with black, and then the bodice was like the same color and value mostly as the rest of her, so it just looked weird where the black was like the only dark element, and then there was this other area that was not following suit. So once I colored that in, I think it really just, it brought that area together, and it made sure that the dark black areas weren't standing out on its own anymore. But that is pretty much it for today's Inktober. I feel really good about this mostly because it was something that I learned a lot from, and it did end up looking very different from what I originally thought it would look like when I was planning it out. And I like that. I like that I was able to learn things and see how I can do it better in future pieces, especially in Inktober. So I'm really excited to revisit some of the things that I tried out in this piece. But yeah, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you tomorrow at my next Inktober.